So the events of this story still make me think back to that night, and I'm still trying to process what exactly happened. The events that took place on this strange night were about 10 years ago from the moment I'm writing the story. My friends and I were 17 years old and spent most of our weekends with each other, a habit that started back in elementary school, playing video games and sleeping at each other's houses. All through middle school and high school, this was our weekend routine. At one point during senior year, we decided that we wanted to mix things up a little bit by taking a little night drive. It was myself, who had a license and a car at this point, and my two friends, Robbie and Scott. My parents trusted us because, all things considered, we were good kids. The night started out like most nights. Scott and Robbie showed up at the house to sleep over for the night. We ordered some pizza, played some games, and just talked about school for a little bit. Shortly after 11 p.m., we decided to go for a ride. For no other reason than to listen to some music and just exchange some good old-fashioned conversation. We just drove for a while, turning down roads that we didn't even know existed, and before we knew it, we'd been driving for several hours, and I couldn't remember the last time we saw streetlights. It was extremely dark and desolate wherever we ended up driving. Around 1, maybe a little bit later, we were driving down this really eerie and very poorly lit road when we approached a car that was on the side of the road. But it was not just parked on the side of the road. It was kind of somewhat crooked, and the hood was tucked into the shrubs, almost as if though the car had lost control and got into an accident. The red taillights were still giving off a soft glow on the road, and Robbie suggested that we look in case someone fell asleep at the wheel or something bad really happened. If someone had got into an accident, it would have taken hours for paramedics to find them if we didn't do something right now. We slowly and cautiously approached the vehicle. It was an older red Honda Civic. We got out of our car slowly and began approaching this red car. Robbie said in this really brave voice, "Hey, anybody there? You hurt?" And there was no response. And as we got closer, I shouted, "Wait." While we were walking over, I started to make out some type of figures in the back seat just sitting up. And Robbie shouted again, and this time with a bit of urgency in his voice, "Hey, are you okay?" Again, there was no response. No noise at all except for the motor of my car running several feet behind us. After a moment, Robbie finally said whatever and approached the red car, and we followed closely behind him, even though I felt something was wrong in my gut. We all were shaken with immediate fear as we went up to the window. There was, in fact, a person in the back seat, but almost more hauntingly, it was a mannequin, not a real person. And my first thought was, who in God's name would drive around with essentially a lifelike doll in the back seat? Admittedly, we got a good laugh out of this for a moment, but then the paranoia of this situation came back. Robbie continued to scream if anybody needed help or assistance, but there was still no response. And this is when I noticed that this mannequin had something in its plastic hands. It looked like some sort of tape, a VHS tape. Without thinking, I took the tape, and I didn't even tell my friends until later that night. We decided to just call the police, which we should have done in the first place, and we reported this abandoned car. The police asked for the license plate number, and that's when we noticed that there was no license plate on the car. Whoever ditched this car either didn't have plates or took those plates with them, and all they left behind was that creepy mannequin with that old VHS tape. So we made our statement and told the cops the location of the car and left. Later that night, while we were talking about this incident and just how crazy it was, and that's when I told my friends about that tape that I took from the car. In a sort of shock and perhaps a bit upset that I didn't mention it before, they of course wanted to watch it right away. On the sticker in front of the tape was this plain white sticker that only just said, "Watch me," written in black marker with very crudely drawn skull and bones. I had some pause, but decided that we had to watch it. Curiosity was getting the best out of all of us at this point, and I found my parents' old VHR in the crawl space and hooked it up to the TV. The tape began with about 5 seconds of a black screen and just the sound of a static tone. Then a man came on the screen with a beard and long hair. The quality of the tape was horrible. He stared into the camera, almost as if though he were staring right at us, and he wore a red flannel and sat at a table next to what appeared to be a workbench of some kind. He stared into the lens for 2 minutes straight without saying a single word. We watched the time, and it was the most unsettling 2 minutes of my entire life. And after those 2 minutes, he laughed, and then sort of morphed that laugh into a cry, all while staring directly into the lens, and finally said in this sort of low, monotone voice, "This tape belongs to me, and I know you have it. I'll find it again, and you'll be sorry." He then followed this with another horrible laugh and cry combo. We then fast-forwarded the tape for several minutes, and nothing else was said other than a few laughs and just this strange man staring at the camera. And finally it just cut to black, and it ended. Now, after a bit of conversation about this situation, being stupid kids, we decided not to give the tape to the police. I just kept it. And after all these years, the tape still sits in my bookcase. I'll never watch it again, and I've never even really spoke about this event until now, writing it down. And I'm sure this is just some kind of stupid joke, but to us kids, this was burned into our brains for years, and I'm still kind of scarred by the mental images that I witnessed that night. Every time I see a man that resembles that man from the tape, even after all these years, I still get that pit of the stomach type feeling, and I'm reminded of that fear and paranoia that I felt in that evening. Why did he have a mannequin in his back seat? Why did he crash his car? And why did he have a tape there? I always had a really hard time focusing when it came to schoolwork. I've had some traumatic experiences in my life, and as a result, it just makes me feel off. I can't focus at all when I'm home. Even when it's quiet, every little thing bothers me, and I feel like I just read the same line a million times. In my sophomore year of college, I started driving to a secluded location and doing all my readings for school. I didn't live far from the country, so it would only take me about 20 minutes to drive to a peaceful location. I found the peace and tranquility of nature to be soothing. I know it may sound crazy to some people that I would drive that far just to do homework, but I really had no choice. It ended up being the only way that I could concentrate on my work. When the end of my senior year was approaching, I started to freak out about one of my big exams. The exam was 40% of my final grade, and I needed at least a 75 on the exam to pass the course. I decided that I was going to spend the weekend before the exam studying, and that I was going to make my own little adventure out of the experience. Instead of going to my usual spot, I was going to travel to an area a few hours away, hike the beautiful trails, and find a nice quiet spot to study. I left first thing Saturday morning and arrived at my destination around 10 in the morning. I spent the early part of the day hiking until roughly 2 in the afternoon. I found this amazing spot near the top of a steep hill. It was a clearing that overlooked a bunch of trees. There were some rocks on top of the hill, and I was able to get comfortable with my books and computer. I started reading my textbook, and I thought that I could hear the sound of twigs snapping. Now, in my distracted brain, all I could concentrate on was the sound of the twigs. It was driving me crazy. I first thought that there was some sort of deer or chipmunk or something that was prancing around in the woods. I thought that I could go over and maybe scare the animal, and whatever it was would just flee further into the woods and away from me so I could focus. I made my way over to the edge of the tree line and shouted some nonsense noises to try to scare whatever it was. But I heard nothing. I made a sound again, clapped my hands together, and again I heard nothing. I stared intently through the thick trees, and I swear that I saw a silhouette of a person move, but I figured that my mind was playing tricks on me. I kept looking for a little while longer, and I realized that the noise had stopped. I thought to myself that whatever I did must have worked. I sat back down and started to read my textbook again, but now I couldn't concentrate because I couldn't help the feeling that something wasn't right. I flipped through the pages several times, and once I realized that I wasn't retaining anything, I decided to pack my things up and head back. I was fairly far away from where I parked anyway, so I figured it was time to walk back, and I would just find a spot to study that was closer to where I parked. When I walked over to the tree line, I paused instantly. Standing about 30 feet away, shrouded in the trees, was the backside of somebody. It appeared to be a man since the shoulders were so broad, but because the back was facing me, I couldn't be sure. They were dressed in all black, and it looked like they were wearing something on their face. I didn't move or say anything. I just stood there frozen and tried to calm down since I had a million thoughts flying through my head. It felt like an eternity, but in reality it was probably only seconds later, and the person turned abruptly, facing me. And I can't accurately express how much fear I felt in this moment. The mask was horrifying. I would guess that it was homemade since I had never seen a mask like this in my life. It appeared to be white, but also appeared to have a long snout hanging from the mask. It almost looked like a mask from one of those scenes in Beetlejuice, if anyone knows what I'm talking about, except somehow this was creepier in the moment. As I said, the mask was white and not skin-colored like in the movie. The eyes on the mask were jet black, and wild hair protruded from the mask. I think the hair was attached to the mask and not the person because it was sort of a mustard yellow color. The person started to hum, and I didn't notice it at first, and I didn't realize that it wasn't some melody. It was a really drawn-out hum, like a sort of groan coming from this person, and they started to step closer to me. I freak out. The clearing that I was on was not big, so in order to walk back to the trail, I would have to walk by this person. I could have slid down the hill, but I probably would have broken my computer and most likely broken my legs since it was extremely steep and very high up. This person started to run, full speed at me, still making that horrible groaning noise. I still can't even believe what happened next. The person ran at me, stops, right in front of me. I'm frozen there. And they laugh. And then they just start humming again, but didn't actually lay a single finger on me. Not wanting to know what was happening or taking any chances, I just ran as fast as I could around them. The entire time that I was running, I could hear this person seemingly trying to follow close behind me, still humming, but I didn't bother turning around. I finally made it to my car, and that person was no longer following me. I tried calling the police, but of course, my phone service was pretty shoddy out there, and I drove several miles to the closest town. I called the police once I got there and reported what had happened, and I don't think they did anything since technically the person didn't do anything other than just disturb me, and there were no other complaints. I have no idea what that freak was doing in the woods. I don't know if they were on something, playing some type of prank, or truly messed up enough to actually hurt someone. It seems unlikely that it was a prank since I didn't see anybody else in the woods, and it seemed like we were the only two humans in the area. I realize I shouldn't complain since I was unharmed in the incident, but the psychological trauma that I felt, it still sticks with me to this day. I'll never forget that terrible afternoon, and the memory of that horrible mask.
When I was in my early 20s, I had a friend with a psychotic alcoholic father. She didn't live with him, she lived in a remote little coastal town. Now and again, we would go together to visit him and stay the night. My relationship with him was creepy in itself, but that isn't the subject now. One night when we were visiting, my friend and her dad had gotten into a drunken blow-up. He kicked us out of the house. This was around midnight, and we'd gotten a lift down and I hadn't had a car. My friend's dad lived about 4 kilometers out of town, by the way of a dirt road. So we start walking down that dirt road back to town, where there was a telephone booth. This was in the days before it was commonplace to have a mobile phone. I was going to call my folks, who lived about an hour and a half away, and see if they would come get us. The whole way to town, my friend was drunkenly moaning and crying about her broken relationship with her father, and she hadn't let up by the time we finally reached the phone booth. She sat on the bench next to the phone while I woke my parents up. They agreed to come and get us, and I sat down on the bench for a long wait. Shortly after this, a van appeared up and parked just behind the bench we were sitting on, maybe 5 meters away. There were 2 young men in the front seats, and they were looking directly at us. If that didn't make me nervous enough, the van door slid open. Then I saw there were a number of young guys in the back. I don't remember how many exactly, but definitely more than 2. The place that we were sitting at was completely deserted. There were no houses nearby, just more road. No people, nowhere to run, no one driving by. It was a shitty little nowhere town. I stood up so I could see them better. I kept my eyes fixed on the van full of men, acutely aware of our vulnerability. What I saw was that they were looking back at us. They were talking amongst themselves quietly at first. Then they started talking more and more loudly, and it had now become evident. They were deliberately talking loudly enough for us to hear. Talking about pulling us into the van, taking us somewhere to fuck us and kill us. I can't remember the exact words, but that was the gist of the situation. My whole body was not shaking, but quaking with terror. I couldn't take my eyes off the men. I remember the face of one of them so clearly that I could draw it now. He was just sitting in the door of the van, looking at me with no expression, looking at me with dead eyes, looking at me like I was a thing. All this time, my drunk friend hadn't stopped sobbing to herself. Whether she knew the van was there or not, I couldn't say. I knew I had to tell her about that danger, but I was actually so full of terror myself, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. That was when the most incredible thing happened. My friend's father, who has never apologized to anyone in his life, and who was the most awkward prick alive, appeared out of nowhere, drunk, in his car. It's hard to describe how unlikely it was for him to do this. He could hold a grudge like no one you've ever met. He was such a stubborn man. And he and my friend had an emotional reunion. The whole time my eyes were fixed on that van still. The men had now stopped talking and were just watching us. "Let's go," I said. We got back into the car and started heading back for my friend's dad's house. Then the van started up and they began to follow. I tried to explain to my friend's dad about the men, but he said, "Just slow down and they can pass." They slowed down to a crawl behind us. Then they began to shout out the windows, screaming more threats. They followed us all the way down that dirt road, and then all the way down the driveway of my friend's father. They just sat in the van behind us, and we sat in the car, waiting to see what would happen. All of my friend's dad's neighbors were holiday homes, and nobody was in that night. We all knew that if the men decided to get out of that van and carry out any of those threats, we would receive no help. Thankfully, after a very long time, the van backed out of the driveway and left. My parents came in a panic to the house when they couldn't find us at the shops. My friend's dad hid in shame, and I went back to my family's house. I've been asked if I went to the police, but I don't remember. I don't think I did. It was just a really messed up time in my life. But that incident changed me forever. I'm a very fearful person now, very overprotective of my kids. And I don't want to change, because I'd rather be like this than accidentally trust one of the millions and millions of psychos out there. I was a live-in caretaker for a 94-year-old woman with Alzheimer's for about a year and a half. She moved into her daughter's home deep in the woods in the middle of nowhere, Washington. Marie was prone to say weird things, like that her sister, who was deceased, mother, who was deceased, and husband, who was also deceased, were in the house or outside regularly. I myself have been working with dementia patients for years, so it never really got to me or bothered me. But Marie was terrified of those woods. She would always tell me how there's dangerous animals out there and how I could get lost easily, so I must always stay inside. She was also worried about her mother and husband having to travel through them. Again, this really wasn't worrisome behavior given her health condition. I'd been working with her for about 6 or 7 months when I would start waking up to her walking down the halls in the middle of the night. Sundowning is fairly normal for people with Alzheimer's, so again, I wasn't troubled by any of this. But she started going to a specific window and giggling, like she was interacting with someone outside the window. When I asked what she was doing, she'd say, "My mother is out there." Kinda weird, but there's a different perception in her world now. One night, in the dead of winter, her daughter and I are awoken to the blaring sound of the house alarm. The daughter and I checked the doors and windows, none of which seemed to be disturbed or unlocked. The only thing missing is Marie. She's nowhere in the house. Panicked, I rush outside to find her, while her daughter continues to search the house. No tracks anywhere, no disturbed snow, nothing. After 10 to 15 minutes of yelling and searching the woods, I start making my way back to the house where her daughter already was in the process of calling 911. As I approach the house, I see Marie, standing outside the window she normally stood at giggling. There's not a single footstep in the snow around her, nor is she cold to the touch. She's just standing there, laughing at nothing. Didn't even know she was outside. Her late night window visits became more and more frequent after this, but less happy. She'd get combative with the window and scream at whoever she believed to be there. Then it just stopped one day. One of the last conversations I had with Marie before she passed, she told me not to let them take me into those woods. And I hope they didn't. When I was 7 years old, my father took my older brother and I to a cabin in the middle of literally nowhere for a week as a vacation. We also took our cat with us. Everybody had their own room, and I had the room furthest from the other two, positioned right where the woods started. There was a window right next to my bed, and on the right side, there was a tree right next to it that I remember getting to climb the previous day without success. The bedrooms were on the second floor, by the way, and the window didn't have any curtains or blinds to cover it. One night, I remember feeling really homesick and unable to sleep. The cat was lying on the bed with me. I was reading a comic book with a flashlight when around 2 a.m., I began hearing a tapping on my window. At first, I just assumed it was a tree branch tapping on the window because it was a windy night after all. And that was until I began to hear whispers. I just remember freezing in fear, feeling like a bunch of ice water had just been poured on top of me. I could hear whoever it was tapping and then saying things like, "Open up, son, it's Daddy. Let me in, Luke, it's cold out here." And the worst one I heard was, "Come on, it's Daddy, I just want to cuddle." I was paralyzed by fear. I just lay on my side, facing away from the window, terrified, close to tears. I knew it wasn't my father, and in my imagination, I thought it was the boogeyman or some kind of other creature. It would kill me. All the while, my cat was hissing and clawing at this guy. I just remember holding him, burying my face into his fur because he felt like a safety net. My one defense against this guy is I couldn't work up the nerve to call for my father. Then I remember hearing this horrible screeching noise. I looked around to see what it was. And I could see this guy with the most maniacal grin that I've ever seen, like something out of a horror movie, dragging a pocket knife against the glass, making that horrendous noise. I found my voice and screamed bloody murder. The grin disappeared. He looked like a combination of horrified and absolute full of rage. But then my father came barreling into the room with his hunting rifle. And as you can imagine, seeing that made this guy panic and sort of drop backwards. My father looked at me and made sure I was okay. My brother ran in the room, and then my father went off to go catch this guy, hopefully before he got away. But unfortunately, it wasn't a long drop, and the man probably only got a few bruises from it. He was definitely gone by the time my father got out there. We waited the night. Nobody slept. Before we packed up and went home the following day. I have no clue if they ever caught that guy, though I remember my father following a police report and having me talk to the police to give them a description. I'm still grateful for my cat. He turns 14 this week and is still as feisty as ever, for providing me comfort during that awful, terrifying night.
I was only 10 the last time that my family had gone to our cabin for a vacation. We used to go every year, but after that time, we stopped, which I was glad about because something really strange happened the last time I was there. It was me, my older sister, my mother, and my father. They had all gone to sleep and I was restless. I mean, it was early and I was 10, so I didn't know what to do with myself. I ended up making the foolish decision to sneak out and stare at the stars. We didn't get those kinds of sights in the city, so I snuck out of the cabin as quietly as I could and made my way to the fire pit. The fire had long been put out, but it was a good place to sit and overlook the field near the cabin and see the stars. As I sat there, I looked out into the field, and at first, I couldn't tell what I was seeing. It looked like something was moving in the tree line just beyond the field. It wasn't until it stepped out into the light that I realized it was a man, and he appeared to be heading towards the woods on the other side of the field. As he made his way through the field, I could see more and more of what he was doing because of the moonlight. I noticed he was dragging something that looked heavy. My heart just about to stop, though when I noticed he stopped moving and turned in my direction, I wasn't sure that he saw me until I noticed he lifted his hand, and I swear he waved. I was so scared, however, to my relief, he just kept on moving. I immediately went inside and didn't say anything about it to my parents. I didn't want to get in trouble for sneaking out. It wasn't until 5 years later, when we were all sitting outside of our home, enjoying some takeout by the pool, that I ended up bringing it up. I didn't think anything of it. We had just been talking about some scary things that happened to us, so I thought it would be a good one to share, but the look on my dad's face told me that I had said something that really freaked him out. That was when he explained to me why we had never gone back to that cabin. Apparently, 2 weeks after we had left and gone home, my parents were questioned by the police considering a body that they found near our cabin just a few days after we had left. Apparently, upon searching the area, police found 9 different bodies buried in the property. I will absolutely never forget what I saw that night, or how lucky I am still to be here. I was so excited to be getting back to the cabin with my cousins. It had been a few years since I had been able to join them on their weekend hunting trips, but finally, our schedules lined up and my parents let me go with them. It was just me, my 2 cousins, and their dad, my uncle. We made it to the cabin and began to unpack. The boys and I couldn't wait to get outside and run around the woods for a little while before it got dark. So, that's exactly what we did. We dropped our stuff off and immediately ran outside. We were out there for about 2 hours before my uncle called us in for dinner. When we got inside, he seemed a bit weird, but I didn't think anything of it. I just sat down and got ready for some dinner. That was when my uncle asked my older cousin if he remembered leaving the door open or anything like that. He seemed to think that a squirrel or some sort of animal had gotten in and had been rummaging through whatever they had left there. My cousin said no, and that was the end of that conversation. We didn't speak another word about it. We just enjoyed our pasta and talked about our plans for the next day. All through the meal, though, I couldn't help but shake the feeling like something was looking at us. Again, I just brushed it off like it was nothing and finished eating. After a few hours, it was time for bed. My cousins and I got to stay in the living room of the cabin, on the pull-out couch and the reclining chair, while my uncle slept in the room that was in the back of the cabin. It took a while because we didn't have a TV, but we eventually fell asleep. However, about an hour after finally passing out, I woke up to my younger cousin shaking me. When I asked him what he needed, he didn't move, but I noticed his eyes were locked onto the window. When I looked, I couldn't help but scream. On the other side of the window, I could see a full-grown man looking in at us. I yelled so loud that I startled everyone in the cabin awake. My older cousin and my uncle It was so loud that even the man outside the window seemed shocked. My uncle came running out to ask me what happened. We explained everything, and without a second question, my uncle grabbed his cell phone and called the local police. They said they would be at the cabin in about 10 minutes. So until then, we all went into my uncle's room where he had his hunting rifle. And that was where we waited until the police arrived. After about 20 minutes of searching the woods, they found a man who had been hiding out in the bushes about a mile away. When they found him, the police said that he had a knife on him that looked like a kitchen knife. It was one of the ones from the cabin. To this day, the only conclusion that we could come up with is that the man had been staying in the cabin without my uncle knowing, and when we showed up, he had to leave, but he left prepared to come back and take the cabin by force. I'm thankful every day that my little cousin managed to see the man before anything bad could have happened.